We're in the defense track, and we're here to listen to exploit mitigation improvements in Windows 8. We have Matt Miller and Ken Johnson.
All right, thanks everybody. As our proctor said, my name is Matt Miller.
I'm Ken Johnson.
And we work in the Microsoft Security Engineering Center. The team that we work on focuses on finding new ways to make it harder for people to find vulnerabilities and making it harder for people to actually write exploits for them. And what we're going to talk about today is some of the fruits of the labor that ourselves and other people at Microsoft have worked on throughout Windows 8 to actually make it harder for people to write exploits for vulnerabilities, not just in Microsoft products, but also on products that are found in software that runs on Windows. So with that, let's go ahead and dive in. Before we get started, I do want to make a special point to acknowledge the individuals who actually worked very hard to make this work happen. I think externally it's easy to just see Microsoft as a big entity, but in practice there are individual people working really hard to make these kind of improvements. And while Ken and I happen to be the two people up here talking about these improvements today, it wasn't just us that worked on this. So there were people across Windows, Visual Studio, our team, and so on and so forth that worked really hard to make this happen. So we just want to acknowledge their hard work in this space. Before we dive into kind of the core of what we're going to talk about, I did want to set some context and provide an overview for the broad areas that we've invested in with respect to security for Windows 8. You can kind of bucket these into 4 areas. Of course, we made a ton of security improvements, but these are kind of 4 broad brush strokes that we can focus on for security-related changes in Windows 8. It probably comes as no surprise that Windows 8 continues to follow the security development lifecycle. This is a set of policies and procedures that Microsoft has defined that set the best practices for how we design software, how we implement it, and how we test it. And this goes a long way for us to make sure that we find and fix vulnerabilities before our products ship, and it's something that we continue to follow through in Windows 8. Another area that we've invested in is improving our technology to secure the boot process in Windows. And this is designed to prevent bootkits and rootkits. So for UEFI-enabled systems, this is designed to prevent malware from starting before Windows itself starts. And it's also meant to protect the remainder of the boot process itself. And this is including early launch anti-malware software. We've also taken steps to secure after the machine is booted. And one of the things that we've done here is we've actually integrated Windows Defender into Windows by default. So now customers can be protected with an antivirus solution that comes shipping with Windows itself. And we've also taken the application reputation features of Internet Explorer, if you're familiar with Smart Screen Filter, and we've actually integrated that into the platform itself so that customers can be protected from malware regardless of what browser they use. It's just an integrated part of the platform. But for our scope today, we're really going to focus specifically on the work that we've done to do what we call securing the core. And what we mean by this is this involves integrating features that we typically call mitigations into the platform itself that make it difficult and costly for malware authors to develop reliable exploits or vulnerabilities. So this is going to be the focus of what we talk about today. To set the stage for this, we like to think about this problem in terms of what we call exploit economics, and what other people in the industry call exploit economics as well. And as many problems do, a lot of things really do boil down to economics. And from, in this context, you can think about an attacker as wanting to achieve some kind of return on investment by leveraging some vulnerability in software. And there's a very simple formula to model some of the costs and returns that they stand to gain from this. So on the cost side, the attacker has to invest in first finding a vulnerability and then actually weaponizing that vulnerability. And that means developing a reliable exploit for it. And then on the return side, the number of times that they can actually use that exploit and the amount that they stand to gain is what's going to determine their return. So from the attacker's perspective, of course they want to maximize their return on investment. They want to cheaply find vulnerabilities, and in practice they only really need one good vulnerability, whereas from a vendor's perspective, we actually need to find and eliminate all vulnerabilities. So this is an interesting imbalance to keep in mind. And from the attacker's perspective, they want to drive down the cost of developing a weaponized exploit. So they want to be able to use cookie cutter techniques that they can apply to all the different vulnerabilities that they come into contact with. And of course, they want to maximize the window of time that they can actually apply the exploit for their vulnerability. Now, of course, from the vendor's perspective, like Microsoft, we want to do the opposite. So we want to drive up their cost of acquiring a vulnerability. We want to do things that allow us to find and eliminate classes of vulnerabilities from our products and actually enable our partners to do this as well. And we also want to drive up the cost of weaponizing a vulnerability. And this means we want to do things like break cookbook techniques that attackers come up with. And it also means making exploits unreliable so that it's not going to succeed on every machine that the attacker goes after. And on the flip side, we want to drive down the amount that they stand to gain through exploiting a vulnerability. So this means that we want to minimize the window of time that they can actually do this, such as by intelligently using telemetry so that we become aware of these things sooner. And we also could actually minimize the amount that they stand to gain from any particular exploit, such as by employing sandboxing technologies to help protect user data and privacy. So these are some of the ways that we can think about, from a vendor's perspective, how we can try to minimize the attacker's return on investment. For the scope of our presentation today, we're going to really focus specifically on what we've done in Windows 8 to improve our exploit mitigation technology, which is meant to increase the cost of developing a reliable exploit for a vulnerability. Now, before we can talk about what we've done in Windows 8, we need to spend a little bit of time describing the work that we've done in the past, because Windows 8 isn't the first version of Windows to include exploit mitigation technology. In fact, we've been doing this since Windows XP Service Pack 2. So the way that we're going to set this stage is we're going to paint some broad strokes here. In general, when you think about memory safety vulnerabilities, you can generally bucket them into kind of two types of vulnerabilities. There are vulnerabilities that involve corruption of memory that's on the stack, and there are vulnerabilities that involve corruption of memory that's on the heap. Now, that's not precisely true. There are other types of corruptions that can happen, but for our purposes, it helps to kind of put them into those two contexts. And so, first of all, when we look at the stack-based vulnerability, what attackers have done over time is they've come up with a number of different techniques that they can employ to take a stack-based memory corruption vulnerability and turn that into something that gives them control of the instruction pointer. And as we'll see in a minute, control of the instruction pointer is really the first step to getting arbitrary code execution. So they developed a number of techniques. The canonical example is the return address overwrite. Some other examples are overriding local variables and parameters on the stack. And for Windows, there's also overriding structured exception handler records on the stack. Now, in turn, Microsoft has responded by developing a number of technologies that are designed to thwart these techniques that attackers have come up with for turning a stack-based memory corruption vulnerability into something that gives them control of the instruction pointer. So we've developed technologies such as GS, which is stack cookies, if you've heard of it, and we've had a number of iterations of that over time. And we've also developed technologies to make it more difficult to exploit a SEH overwrite, and this includes technologies like safe SEH and SEHOP. But as you can see, these technologies don't cover all the cases. There are still some cases where stack-based memory corruption could allow an attacker to get control of the instruction pointer. So there are still some things that are left unmitigated today. As I mentioned, there are kind of these two broad buckets, and the other bucket are heap-based vulnerabilities. And like the stack-based memory corruption vulnerabilities, attackers over time have come up with ways to turn a heap-based memory corruption into something that can give them control of the instruction pointer. There are a variety of techniques here. If you went and saw Chris Balasek and Tarjay's talk, they talked about some of the things with respect to heap-based memory corruptions. But attackers have been looking at this for a long time, and they developed a bunch of different techniques to do this. And in turn, we've responded in Windows XP Service Pack 2 and Windows Vista, and we've developed hardening measures within the heap itself that try to close off some of these techniques that attackers have come up with. But as you can see, at least in Windows 7 and previous, there are still some techniques that attackers can apply that aren't mitigated today that could allow an attacker to get control of the instruction pointer. And finally, whether it's a stack-based memory corruption or it's a heap-based memory corruption, once you have control of the instruction pointer, attackers have come up with different methods to take that, control of the instruction pointer, and turn it into something that gives them arbitrary code execution on the machine. There are trivial examples like executing code directly from the stack or the heap, or more involved examples like executing code from loaded images, whether it be return-oriented programming, return to libc, and so on. And as you might expect, we've integrated support for features in Windows that try to counter these techniques. So we integrated support for data execution prevention, or DEP, in Windows XP Service Pack 2. And we integrated support for ASLR, address space layout randomization, in Windows Vista. And these counter a lot of the techniques that attackers employ today. But with that said, attackers have come up with other techniques that allow them to bypass some of these countermeasures. So one of them is JIT spraying, which we've actually released mitigations for in Internet Explorer 9, and other things like predictable memory mappings or address space information disclosures as being a way to circumvent ASLR. So as you can see, there are still vectors that attackers can use to turn control of the instruction pointer into arbitrary code execution. So with that stage set, I thought it would be helpful to kind of give you a summary of our perspective about the state of memory safety exploits on Windows. And there are a couple of key points that I'd like to drive home here. The first point that we see is from the data that we actually collect in the wild, we see that most of the systems today, we believe, are not compromised due to exploits. If you look at our security intelligence report, we released an article in there that talked about how we believe 6% of infections that were removed by a tool that we have called the malicious software removal toolkit. We believe that 6% of those infections were likely caused by exploits. And this tells us that in practice, at least with this data, the majority of the machines that are infected are not infected through exploitation vectors. And what's even more interesting here is the vulnerabilities that were exploited there were actually exploiting vulnerabilities that had security updates available for more than a year. And so this really drives home the point that one of the best ways for you to stay protected, and I think the people in this audience know this, but one of the best ways for you to stay protected against exploitation in the wild is to make sure you stay up to date on your patches. It's critical. Another point here that we see today is that most exploits actually target third-party applications. Most of the exploits that we see in the wild don't actually go after Microsoft applications. There was a research paper published by Dan Guido. It was something he called the Exploit Intelligence Project, where he showed that for popular exploit kits in 2011, 11 of the 13 CVEs that were exploited there actually targeted non-Microsoft applications. So that's an interesting data point for kind of widespread exploitation. Most of the vulnerabilities are actually not in Microsoft software. Another thing that we see is that most of the exploits out there today actually target older versions of Windows. Again, in our security intelligence report, we had an article where we showed that if you take, we had about 184 exploit samples of document formats essentially. And if you just go and try to run those exploits on Windows 7, only 5% of them work. Whereas if you run them on Windows XP, the majority of them do succeed. So we believe that a big contributing factor to this are the mitigations that we've introduced already in Windows 7, such as ASLR. And this really drives up the cost of exploitation and hinders people from actually even trying to exploit those targets. And one other data point that we see is that most of the exploits fail when you enable mitigations. So again, if you look at, I believe this from Dan Guido's research, he saw that of the 19 exploits that were in these popular exploit kits that he looked at, if you enabled DEP, then 14 of them just failed. So just by enabling data execution prevention, 14 of those 19 exploits failed. And we also see that of those 184 exploit samples that I mentioned earlier, if you use IMIT and enable that on Windows XP, then about 90% of them fail. So just by enabling mitigations, that's enough to perturb those exploits enough that they fail. But yet we do have to be diligent and recognize that there are exploits today that are capable of bypassing the latest mitigations and that are capable of targeting the latest versions of our products and other products. For instance, some data points here, the zero-day issues were exploited in very sophisticated attacks such as Stuxnet and Dooku and some other attacks over the past few years. And if you look at the Pwn2Own competition from this year, you can see that both Chrome and Internet Explorer 9 had exploits written for them that were capable of bypassing the mitigations that we have available today. So although the data suggests that exploits may not be the most common vector of infection and most of the exploits don't target or work on the latest versions of the platforms, it is still possible, and there are data points that suggest that this still happens. So the bottom line for us is that we do need to invest in continuing to increase the cost of exploitation for attackers. We haven't driven it down enough to really move everybody out of the game. So that's one of the motivations for us for the work that we've done on Windows 8. Okay, so now we're actually ready to talk about Windows 8. So for Windows 8, we had three high-level objectives that we wanted to go after for improving exploit mitigations. The first was, we want to do everything we can to mitigate entire classes of vulnerabilities. If we have a mitigation that's 100% effective for a particular class of vulnerability, then that vulnerability can no longer be used to elevate privileges. It's a denial of service at best. We also wanted to do things to take those exploitation techniques that attackers have come up with and just break them. And if we can't break them 100%, let's at least make them as unreliable as possible so that the attackers won't be guaranteed that their techniques will succeed all the time. And finally, we wanted to make sure that we did everything we could to increase the cost of exploitation in key domains. So these are the application domains that are commonly exposed to attackers. Web browsers is a great example. So with these objectives in mind, we had 5 different focus areas for where we actually invested in exploit mitigation improvements. We're going to go into detail on all these, but at a high level, code generation security, address space layout randomization, the Windows heap, the Windows kernel, and the system defaults for when certain mitigations are enabled. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Ken to talk about some of the things we've done with respect to code generation. All right.
Thanks, Matt. As Matt mentioned, one of the focus areas that we spent time on for improving security in Windows 8 has been the compiler itself, adding mitigations to the code that the compiler emits to make it more secure, something we call compiler-based mitigations, and I'll be going through some of these today. The first of them is GS. Now GS has been around in the compiler for several compiler releases now, and we've added another round of improvements to it, starting with Visual Studio 2010. And you see that Windows 8 and code that is built and ships with Windows 8 will have these improvements enabled. We've improved GS's heuristics, which decide which functions warrant GS protection and which code constructs especially warrant code protection with GS. One notable example of this is C structures in the stack are now protected by GS. This is especially notable as there have been real-world exploits in the past that were essentially only exploitable because GS was not protecting C structures, such as the A9 vulnerability we had several years back, if you may recall. Now, those kind of vulnerabilities are now blocked by GS, starting with the GS version that we're using in Windows 8. We've also improved the ability of the compiler to optimize away GS checks when it can prove that a section of code is safe and that there can never be a buffer overrun there. And this is important because it allows us to reclaim performance that would otherwise be wasted on an essentially unused GS check, and allows us to reinvest that by being more aggressive with GS in places where we'll have a higher impact as well. The next compiler-based mitigation I'll be talking about is something that we like to call range checks. You can think of range checks as essentially a targeted array bounds check that the compiler adds when it detects certain code sequences that are potentially dangerous. So if you look at the code that we have on the screen here, we essentially have a stack-based buffer of a fixed size, and we have some code that's writing a 0 integer through a variable index. And if you compile this code with range checks enabled, this code in green here is what the compiler would logically be inserting into the final binary. What this code is basically trying to do is to make sure that this array index that we're writing a 0 integer through is actually within the confines of the array. If not, the compiler will omit code to safely terminate the program. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this mitigation is specifically targeted to a certain set of scenarios. A fixed size array, you're writing a 0 integer through it through a variable index. And the array can be on the stack, or it can be a global variable, or a static array. And the reason for this is for performance reasons. Now this is notable as this closes another gap in stack-based vulnerabilities. And it's a gap that has been exploited potentially in the wild. The next compiler-based mitigation I'll be talking about is something we call the sealed optimization, which is actually an optimization in disguise. And this is one of those cool scenarios where you can both improve performance and add extra security at the same time. So sealed is an attribute that you can apply to a C++ class. And what this basically does is it tells the compiler you can't derive this class with a more derived version of it. And this has a couple of consequences, but one of the most important ones is that if you have a virtual method call, the compiler knows, because this class is marked as sealed, that you can't have a class that derives and provides a more specific implementation of the virtual methods that are attached to this class. Now, if you think about the way a virtual method normally works, when you have a call site, for example this one, that has a virtual method call, the compiler will emit some code that goes and looks into the vtable pointer within the object and pulls out the function pointer index corresponding to this virtual method we're going to call. And then it calls it through a call and direct instruction. Now if this class was optimized by had the sealed attribute applied to it, we can devirtualize this virtual method call. What this basically means is, since the compiler knows there can be no more derived implementation of this virtual method, it can get rid of this vtable reference entirely and simply turn this into a standard direct call where the call target is baked into the binary at compile time. Essentially, the upshot of this is if the attacker did have some way to corrupt this vtable in the C++ object header, they can no longer just directly leverage that with the virtual method call to gain control of code execution, because we're no longer even referencing that vtable for these devirtualized function calls. And to give you an idea for some of the impact this has, we've devirtualized around 4,500 virtual function calls in MS-HTML and IE10, around 13,000 in MSO in the new Office. Now, while devirtualizing virtual method calls is a great thing for performance and security when we can do it, there are circumstances when we can't necessarily do this. I mean, there may be code that that relies on being able to provide more derived implementation of virtual methods, and marking those classes as sealed would break the program. For those cases, we've introduced a new mitigation that we call VT guard, or virtual table guard. It's basically a probabilistic mitigation that targets this class of vulnerabilities that would allow vtables to be corrupted. Now, VT guard is enabled by adding a specific attribute to a C++ class that marks it as VT guard aware. Now, if you think about the way the compiler normally lays out a virtual function table or a vtable for a class, you essentially have an array of function pointers that's baked into the binary. This basically describes a set of virtual method call targets that are there that this class implements. Now, if a class is marked as VT guard aware, the compiler will insert an extra entry into this virtual function table, something we call the VT guard cookie. And you can think of this VT guard cookie as really just the address of a special symbol within this module. And the key thing to keep in mind here is because this module has ASLR enabled, the attacker doesn't know the specific value that this VT guard cookie has at runtime. And so they can't easily synthesize a fake VT guard value there. Now, when the compiler goes to emit a call site for a class that has a virtual method, and it's a VT guard aware class, the compiler will add some extra instrumentation here before the call instruction. It basically checks to make sure, does the VT guard cookie exist in this virtual function table that's about to be called through, and does it have the correct value? And if not, some code will be added to safely terminate the program. And the important thing here is that if attacker has a vulnerability that lets them replace this vtable for some reason, they can now just supply an arbitrary vtable because it's checked to make sure the VT guard cookie is there or fail. And you'll see that in IE10 and MS-HTML, we've started to deploy VT guard in a couple of key classes. That being said, I'll hand it back over to Matt for a discussion about ASLR.
All right, thanks, Ken. So I think some of the things that Ken just showed you really showed that how integrating mitigations into the compiler is a really powerful way for us to try to mitigate entire classes of vulnerabilities, and also make sure that the code that we actually generate in our products and products built on top of Visual Studio are more secure by default because they have these mitigations built into the code in the program itself. So with that said, one of the other areas that I mentioned that we made improvements in was address space layout randomization. So to give you a bit of a retrospective, address space layout randomization is something that we actually initially introduced support for in Windows Vista. And from our perspective, this has led to a big shift in attacker mentality. If you remember some of the data points that I cited earlier, where most exploits fail when they run against Windows 7, we believe a big factor of that is ASLR. Just by virtue of randomizing where our images and the stack and the heap are located, that perturbs exploits enough that they fail. With that said, if attackers today are looking to bypass ASLR, they do it in a few different ways. One way that they do it is they take advantage of images that don't indicate that they support ASLR. When we implemented support for ASLR, we needed to do it in a way that was backward compatible with applications. So individual XEs and DLLs actually have to set a bit in their image that says they're capable of being randomized. And if they don't set this, they can still be loaded at a predictable address. And attackers have leveraged this when developing exploits because it gives them a predictable memory region. Another technique that attackers use is something called address space spraying. And this is either heap spraying or JIT spraying, and it's basically just a way of filling up a large portion of the address space with data or code that the attacker controls. And as I mentioned, they'll try to also leverage predictable memory regions. So not necessarily just DLLs and XEs, but other regions of memory that happen to be located at the same address in every process. And also information disclosures. If you went to Furman Cerna's talk earlier today, he went into great detail about how information disclosures can be used to bypass ASLR. And that's something that we are seeing attackers look at more and more. So with that said, we've taken steps to substantially improve ASLR in Windows 8 to try to counter these specific gaps in the implementation today. One of the first things that we did is something that we call forced ASLR or mandatory ASLR. And as I mentioned, many of the exploits today that quote-unquote bypass ASLR is they do this by leveraging DLLs in the address space that haven't been randomized. They're still being loaded at a predictable address. And as I mentioned, this happens because images don't set a bit in their PE header that indicates that they support what's called dynamic base or being randomized. So this example here shows a DLL whose DLL characteristic bit doesn't have the dynamic base flag set. With that said, in Windows 8, we've actually added support for allowing processes to set a flag that says any image that's randomized that is non-ASLR or any image that's loaded that's non-ASLR should be randomized. And the way that this works is it behaves differently from the actual ASLR implementation when you have that bit set. And the way that it works is it behaves similar to there being an address collision. So it's kind of as if the preferred base address didn't exist for the image. And this causes the image to get a new base address other than what its preferred base address would be. And I'll talk about where the entropy comes from this for in a second, something called bottom-up randomization. Now, with that said, this isn't something that we've turned on by default. Processes actually have to say specifically that they want this behavior to happen. And this is, of course, to retain compatibility and also performance. That's something that's very important. So processes have to explicitly turn this on. One other thing I do want to mention is that we've actually backported support for this feature to Windows 7. So if you're up to date on your updates, then your Windows 7 installation already supports this. So that's something else to bear in mind. And we'll talk more about how specifically applications can turn on these features toward the end of the talk. So don't worry, we'll get to that. So the outcome, of course, here is by having Force ASLR turned on for a process, attackers can no longer depend on DLLs and XEs being loaded at a predictable location because all images will have been randomized. Okay, a second thing that we've done is something that we call bottom-up and top-down randomization. If you think about the way that memory is allocated in Windows, and in fact most other operating systems, there are kind of three different ways that memory is allocated. It's either allocated it's allocated one way by specifying a specific base address where memory should be mapped, or it's allocated by saying, I don't know where I want to be allocated at, so it tells the kernel to start searching from the bottom up for a free region that satisfies what's been requested. And on Windows, you can also have what are called top-down allocations, where the search will happen starting from the top of the address space and going down. This is typically used for PEBs and TEBs, and you can also explicitly specify it. Whereas bottom-up allocations are used for most allocations in Windows: stacks, heaps, map files, virtual alloc, etc. So if you look at Windows 7, we specifically integrated support to randomize both heaps and stacks on kind of a one-off basis, separate from other memory regions that were allocated. And we also had support for randomizing PEBs and TEBs, but with relatively limited entropy. But what's notable, and what people actually have noticed externally, is that virtual alloc and map view of file don't have any implicit entropy applied to them. There's no randomization applied to them in Windows 7 and below. And as a result of this, predictable memory regions can exist that attackers can potentially take advantage of. So in Windows 8, what we've done is we've taken steps to make sure that all bottom-up and top-down allocations are randomized. And the way that we've done this efficiently is we essentially bias where bottom-up and top-down allocations will start from. So rather than just throwing allocations in random places in the address space, we'll actually shift where the kernel will start searching for memory from for both bottom-up and top-down allocations. And as a result of this, not only do virtual alloc and map view of file and all these other allocation routines receive implicit entropy, but PEBs and TEBs and other things like that as well also receive much more entropy. Now, with that said, both of these mitigations are opt-in. And one way that this is a bit different from most of our opt-in mitigations is that if you already have an executable that has the dynamic base flag set, then both of these will already be turned on. So this isn't something where we'll see people have to specifically set a flag. Existing applications will already take advantage of this in Windows 8. And the outcome here is that predictable memory regions that may have existed previously because of virtual alloc and map view of file have been eliminated through this. Another step that we've taken is to what we call high entropy ASLR for 64-bit processes. One of the big differences between a 32-bit process and a 64-bit process is the size of their address space. On Windows, by default, if you just look on x86, a 32-bit process, you'll get a 2 gig address space. Whereas for a 64-bit process that's large address aware, you'll get an 8 terabyte address space. So this is orders of magnitude larger than a 32-bit process. And because of this means that we have a lot more freedom in terms of where we can position things in the address space without causing unnecessary fragmentation. So we've done three things here. One is we've implemented what we call high entropy bottom-up randomization. So again, this is biasing where bottom-up allocations start from. But for 64-bit processes, with this flag set, we'll actually bias the bottom-up start location within a range of 1 terabyte. So that means the initial allocations could start anywhere from the first 4 gigs of memory up to 1 terabyte into the address space. And what's noteworthy about this is by doing this, we essentially break traditional address space spraying techniques, so heap spraying and JIT spraying. And the reason for this is because machines today don't have sufficient commit to be able to spray the amount of memory that would be needed to guarantee that an allocation would be located at a specific address through bottom-up allocations. You know, it's not feasible for people to spray a terabyte of memory right now. Again, Processes must explicitly turn this on, and the reason for that is compatibility. There are some applications that don't necessarily handle memory addresses being above 4 gigabytes, and they have pointer truncation issues and things like this. So this is something that an application has to specifically turn on to take advantage of this. Like bottom-up randomization, we've also implemented a high entropy top-down randomization, and for this one we'll do 8 gigs of variance and where top-down allocations start. And this is something that's automatically enabled if the process is taking advantage of top-down randomization. And finally, we've taken steps to increase the amount of entropy that images receive, specifically images that are based above 4 gigs. And as a result of increasing this entropy, we've taken steps to move all of the system images above 4 gigs so that they can take advantage of this. And when I say above 4 gigs, that means their preferred base address is above 4 gigs. The outcome here is that because we've increased the amount of entropy that 64-bit processes receive, the probability of guessing an address is significantly decreased. And it also has an impact on information disclosures, because it means that now that we've introduced entropy into the higher order bits above bit 31, this means that attackers actually need to disclose more than just the low 32 bits of an address to know specifically where something's mapped in the 64-bit process address space. So this has an impact on information disclosures as well. So let's talk specifically a little bit about entropy in terms of the improvements that we've made. So if you look at Windows 7, we kind of break it down in terms of the different types of memory allocations. And one of the things that's most noteworthy is, one, bottom-up allocations, top-down allocations, and non-ASLR DLL images all have 0 entropy, just implicitly. And what's also noteworthy is that if you look between 32-bit and 64-bit processes, the entropy is the same, despite the fact, as I mentioned, their address space sizes are substantially different. Now, as you might expect on Windows 8, the story changes quite a bit. So if you look at a 32-bit process that's opted in to bottom-up randomization and has forced ASLR on, we've made sure that all of these memory regions have some baseline level of entropy. 8 bits is the minimum. So that means 1 in 256 chance of guessing correctly. And on Windows 8 for 64-bit, we've significantly increased it for stacks, PEBs, TEBs, XEs, and DLLs. And specifically, if you enable the high entropy bottom-up randomization, those numbers go up substantially. So 24 bits of entropy, which is what equates to that 1 terabyte of variance. So as you can see, we've substantially increased the amount of entropy across the board for ASLR and user mode processes. And finally, we've also taken steps to the degree that we can to try to remove generic information disclosure vectors. So as Furman mentioned in his talk, it's possible to use an address space information disclosure to bypass ASLR. If you can learn where a DLL is loaded or where a heap is loaded, then you can use that to your advantage when developing an exploit. So some of the steps that we've taken here is that in a 64-bit process, and even in a 32-bit process, disclosure via a flaw that enables you to read from anywhere in the address space is now less reliable. And this is because predictable mappings have been eliminated. This is more the case on 64-bit processes because the baseline amount of entropy that we apply to all memory regions makes it such that it's, as I said, not really feasible for people to heap spray the address space and be assured that something will be mapped at a specific location. So an attacker actually needs another information leak to learn where something is mapped in the address space before they can try to read from it. And one thing that we've also done is that there's a data structure in Windows called shared user data. And this is a data structure that's mapped at the same address in every process and every version of Windows that we've released to date. And that includes Windows 8. And this is something, of course, that attackers are keyed off of as being interesting because, you know, it's just there in every process and it's something they might be able to make use of. But in Windows 8, we've taken steps to make sure that although this region is still located at the same address, it's no longer particularly useful to attackers. And the way that we've done this is that we've removed pointers that were fields in this data structure that pointed to images in the address space. We've removed those in Windows 8. And this breaks techniques that attackers have used in practice. And it's something that Furman mentioned in his talk as well. And another thing that we've done is we've also shuffled this is kind of orthogonal, but something else that we've done is we've also shuffled the order of the system calls and statically shuffled them in the system call table. And we give an example here. If anybody can tell me why this is interesting after the talk, then you get a bonus prize or something. But yeah, so these are some of the things that we've done to close off some of the generic information disclosure vectors. All right, so those are some of the improvements that we've made to address space layout randomization. But as I mentioned in the initial talk, one of those big broad categories that a lot of vulnerabilities fall into are these heap-based vulnerabilities. And so in Windows 8, we've taken steps to try to better protect the heap against memory corruption. If you went to Chris Valasek or Tarjay's talk, then they went into much more detail than I'm going to go into here. But this kind of gives you an overview of some of the changes that we've made here. So a bit of a retrospective, first of all, to set the context. We believe that the heap hardening that we did in Windows Vista has been very effective in practice in terms of protecting metadata on the heap and preventing attackers from really leveraging it for heap-based memory corruption. To my knowledge, there's only been one documented exploit that corrupts heap metadata, and this was Chris's exploit for the IIS FTP bug. So that tells you something, that really attackers focus pretty much entirely on targeting application data on the heap rather than metadata. But with that said, although there's only been this one documented exploit, attackers have proposed a number of other attacks that could, in principle, be used to attack metadata on the heap. But yeah, like I said, most of the real-world exploits that we see target app data on the heap. They aren't really targeting heap metadata. And the real reason for this is because today, the heap doesn't really have safeguards to protect against application data that's stored on the heap. And when I say application data, I'm talking about C++ objects and other application state. So from a very high level, don't worry, I'm not going to go too deep in terms of algorithms and data structures for the heap, but I did want to give you kind of a high-level overview of the Windows 8 heap architecture. And if you're already familiar with the heap architecture from Windows 7, it's at a high level, it's relatively unchanged. When you use heap alloc to request some memory, it could come from one of three places. Most allocations will come from what we call the front-end allocator or low fragmentation heap. This is used for allocation sizes below or equal to 16K. If you request an allocation that's larger than that, but less than 512K or 1 meg on 64-bit, that will come from what we call the back-end allocator. The back-end allocator is also used by the front-end allocator to request memory. And if you request really large allocations, those will come from what we call the virtual memory allocator, which essentially calls directly into the kernel to request memory to allocate. So this is a very high-level picture of the architecture for the heap, and it's relatively unchanged in Windows 8. So I mentioned the front-end allocator, and I mentioned how the front-end allocator, or low fragmentation heap, is used for the majority of allocations that actually come from the heap in Windows. So this is an area that we've really focused on introducing new integrity checks to better protect metadata on the heap. So I'm going to walk through a couple of the things that we've done here. Chris mentioned most of these in his talk, but this is kind of the rundown. First of all, one of the things that we've done is that the low fragmentation heap is now a bitmap-based allocator. In Windows 7, it actually used essentially a free list implementation for maintaining a linked list of free chunks. That's no longer the case in Windows 8. We now use a bitmap to maintain the free busy state for chunks within a subsegment. And as a result, that one exploit that I mentioned, the ISFTP exploit, the technique that was used in that exploit will no longer work because it relied on corrupting metadata that's no longer used in Windows 8. It's actually no longer there. Another step that we've taken is that in previous versions of Windows, we actually encapsulated a few different areas of the heap in what are called catch-all exception handling blocks. And these are blocks that where if an exception is thrown, such as by accessing an invalid address, it'll simply be caught and the program will continue running. It won't crash. And this could potentially be used to an attacker's advantage. So what we've done is we've removed these catch-all exception handling blocks in Windows 8. And as a result, exceptions are no longer going to be swallowed in those cases. Another step that we've taken is we've made it so that attackers can no longer free the heap handle. This is kind of the main data structure of the heap. And this prevents certain attacks that were described in the research. We've also encoded the commit routine of the heap data structure with a global key versus a key that's stored in a field of the data structure. This also prevents some attacks that were described to get reliable control of the instruction pointer. We now do extended validation of the block headers, and this is to prevent an attack that could allow you to potentially free a heap block prematurely. And we also added checks to both the back-end and the front-end allocator that make it such that you can no longer allocate a block that indicates that it's already busy, that it's already in use. And this prevents a variety of attacks that attempt to reallocate a block that's still in use by the application. And finally, we've also taken steps to enable heap encoding in kernel mode. Previously, this wasn't enabled in kernel mode, and now it is enabled. And of course, the outcome of this is that metadata attacks against the heap are increasingly difficult because we've closed off both some of the applied and theoretical techniques for attacking metadata on the heap. Another major change that we've made is we've introduced support for what we call guard pages. And guard pages in this context are designed to partition the heap such that if there is a sequential overrun vulnerability, that vulnerability, the amount of data that can corrupt is isolated to certain parts of the heap. Particularly if the sequential overflow happens to touch one of these guard pages, that's going to lead to an exception being raised and the process crashing. So the places that we will insert these guard pages is limited to a few places. We can't just enable them after every allocation because that would not be feasible from a performance perspective. So what we do instead is we kind of take a broader approach where when you do large allocations from the heap, we'll make sure that those have a guard page. When new heap segments are allocated, these are kind of big chunks of memory that the heap uses to slice and dice. We'll make sure that heap segments have guard pages around them. And we'll also make sure that what we call maximally sized subsegments from the low fragmentation heap, these are subsegments that have the maximum number of blocks in them or they have a certain size, we will make sure that those are also have a trailing guard page. And this is something that is always the case on 64-bit, but it's actually probabilistic on 32-bit as to whether or not the guard page gets inserted, again for performance reasons. Another major change that we've made is something we call allocation order randomization. And what this does is it basically makes it such that allocations made from the low fragmentation heap, the order in which they will be returned with respect to one another is no longer deterministic. And the reason we do this is because exploits often rely on surgical manipulation of the layout of the heap. They want to place a block that they can overflow directly adjacent to some memory that they want to corrupt. Say it has a vtable pointer. So by randomizing the order in which these blocks are allocated, we make that less reliable so that attackers can't depend on that. So if you look at Windows 7 from LFH, the allocation order is sequential. The attacker can get the heap into such a state where he can make sure that his overflow block comes right before the block that he wants to overflow, the target block. In Windows 8, of course, the allocation behavior is no longer deterministic. So the attacker isn't guaranteed that his overflow block is going to precede the target block that he wants to corrupt. And as a result, an attacker looking to maximize the reliability of their heap-based memory corruption is going to face some challenges here. I mean, it's going to be application-specific and vulnerability-specific. It may require them to corrupt more data to try to overcome the effects of this heap randomization, thus increasing instability by collateral damage to the heap. And it may also require them to allocate more data. And by allocating more data, that may trip the policy for when we decide when to enable guard pages for a particular subsegment. So those are some of the changes we made to the heap. I'm going to hand it over to Ken to talk about the Windows kernel.
All right, thanks, Matt. We made a number of improvements to make user mode exploitation more difficult and more costly in Windows 8. We've also spent a lot of time making the kernel more resilient as well to both vulnerabilities in Microsoft code as well as vulnerabilities in third-party code as well. I'll be going through some of these today. Let's start with the retrospective on exploitation in the Windows kernel at large. Historically, kernel vulnerabilities have been less targeted by attackers in the wild. And there have been a couple of reasons for this, but generally attackers want to target juicy targets like internet browsers or multimedia applications or document file viewers and so on and so forth that tended to be on their remote attack surface, and most of these tend to be user mode applications. And as a logical consequence of this, exploitation techniques for user mode code tend to be a lot more researched and refined than kernel mode exploitation techniques. With that being said, we are starting to see a shift in the attacker mentality. We're seeing more interest in looking for kernel vulnerabilities and exploiting them. We think there are a couple of reasons for this, but one of the big ones is that there's an increasing interest in escaping sandboxes. So those same internet browsers and document viewers and multimedia applications are starting to deploy sandboxing technologies that try to contain the impact of vulnerabilities that may exist in code in their processes. And one of the ways that attackers will try and escape these sandboxes is by looking for vulnerabilities in the kernel that could be allowed to use to circumvent the sandbox as well. We're also seeing increasing refinement for local kernel approvals escalation vulnerabilities. And we're also seeing increasing research as to how the kernel pool protects its internal metadata as well. And in a handful of cases, we have seen some sophisticated remote kernel exploits. All right, so let's dig into some of the details of some of the kernel improvements we've made. One of the improvements is increased enforcement of DEP, data execution prevention, in the Windows 8 kernel. So this chart basically describes which kernel memory regions have NX enforced for various versions of Windows. And as you can see, for Windows 8, we've taken a holistic bottom-up approach to make sure that as many kernel regions as possible have NX enforced for them, especially on 64-bit and ARM as well. There are a couple of data points you may find especially interesting here. The first of them is we introduced a new pool type called non-page pool NX. And as you might imagine from the name of this pool type, pool pages drawn from this allocation type are non-executable. This is a default for ARM, and as well, all inbox components for Windows 8 have generally been converted over to use this pool type as well. The second notable data point here is several of these kernel memory regions that have been converted over to be non-executable in Windows 8 were previously relied on for real-world exploits. For example, the real-world exploit for the SMB server vulnerability several years ago relied on some of these memory regions, like the kernel for like the HAL memory region being executable. Those assumptions are no longer valid for Windows 8, so that exploit code is written would crash if it was run on Windows 8. We've also made substantial improvements to Kernel ASLR on Windows 8 as well. ASLR in the kernel was something we introduced with Vista SP1 and Server 2008. The initial implementation included limited entry for drivers and for the kernel and HAL image as well. We've had some incremental improvements to driver randomization in Windows 7. We've carried these forward with a number of improvements in Windows 8. For example, the kernel segment base, which is basically the start of a memory region where the bootloader in the operating system allocates several early start data structures. For example, the first processor's idle stack and several other data structures that are passed on from the bootloader to the kernel itself. Now has a holistic level of randomization applied to it. So all these data structures have ASLR applied across the board. In addition, we significantly boosted the entropy that the kernel image and the HAL image receive, especially on 64, where we could take advantage of that much expanded kernel address space to provide a much more comprehensive set of randomization there. We've also added support for incoming hardware features called SMEP or PXN. The hardware guys kind of handed us a bit of an alphabet soup here. SMEP stands for Supervisory Mode Execution Prevention, and PXN stands for Privilege Execute Never. What these hardware features basically allow the operating system to do is to enforce a new invariant that if you have code running in kernel mode, it can no longer directly transfer control to a page that's owned by user mode. Now, this is important as a lot of local privilege escalation exploits that are exploiting kernel vulnerabilities today tend to take advantage of this privilege. And if the hardware supports it, we'll basically turn this feature on. Now we're expecting that SMEP and PXN and DEF will make kernel exploitation more difficult. And in some cases, SMEP or PXN would be a strong mitigation for issues. So for example, one of the vulnerabilities in Stuxnet would have been completely mitigated by SMEP and PXN. It would have been impossible to exploit that vulnerability for anything other than a denial of service or a system crash. You could never have gained code from it. That being said, we expect there may still be some circumstances where attackers may be able to leverage already existing code that's legitimately executable in existing kernel images. We've also added comprehensive protection for null dereferences to the kernel in Windows 8. As far as kernel vulnerabilities go, null dereferences tend to be one of the more common issues out there. We've seen a lot of these in the wild. And furthermore, exploitation techniques for these class of vulnerabilities tend to be relatively straightforward. If we think about this, when the kernel dereferences null, this is actually reading memory that's in part of the user mode address space and not the kernel mode address space. So what attackers would typically tend to do is they would allocate the first 64K of memory, or memory within that region, and then instead of dereferencing null when they trigger their vulnerability, the kernel will start interpreting data structures that are allocated by the user or the malicious application. This could potentially allow the application to elevate privileges. Now, we've strongly mitigated this entire class of vulnerabilities, both in third-party code and in Windows code, starting with Windows 8. And we've done this by essentially blocking off this first 64K of memory in every process. So you can no longer allocate memory here. And basically the offshot of this is if you do have a kernel null dereference, the kernel is always going to crash. It's never going to start running attacker-supplied code. As essentially the side effect of this, we've turned off NTVDM by default on 32-bit SKUs, x86 SKUs, and only on x86 32-bit, enabling NTVDM, which must be done by an admin only, will turn off null dereference protection. That can't be done on 64-bit or ARM because those systems have no NTVDM at all. We've also added some integrity checks to the kernel pool. I'm not going to go into the same level of detail that Tarjay did in Tarjay and Chris's cost if you had seen that just a little bit ago. But that being said, let's jump into the details about the pool here. So the kernel pool is essentially a general purpose memory allocator that most code in the kernel, whether that's third-party drivers or the kernel itself or other mode kernel formats could use. So it's conceptually fairly similar to the anti-heap that user mode uses. That being said, the internal implementation details are very different for the kernel. For the kernel pool, it has some different goals from a performance perspective as the user mode heap and different scenarios that it targets. So the implementation is substantially different. And while we spent a number of time in previous RS releases, we've added a lot of hardening into the standard anti-heap, especially in XPSP2 and Vista, and now in Windows 8. We've also taken that forward to add additional extra hardening to the kernel pool as well in Windows 8. We've added encoding that covers a number of internal data structures in the pool. For example, the process build pointer for quota allocations, look-aside lists, delay-free, the pool pages for page pool. We've added pool index bound checks, and we've further expanded safe linking and safe unlinking checks as well. We also made a slew of other improvements that you'll see showing up both in the kernel and in user mode in Windows 8. One of them is something we call safe unlinking or safe linking. And this mitigation basically, when you have a doubly linked list operation that's adding and removing entry from the list, will start verifying the integrity of the neighboring list links when that operation performs. Now, Windows essentially has a standard or a centralized set of libraries that essentially provide this primitive of list entry manipulation. And basically, this set of libraries have been instrumented to have the safe unlinking capability deployed. So you'll see this both in use mode code and in kernel mode code, and also in third-party code that starts to be built with a new Windows 8 WDK. Safe unlinking leverages a new mechanism we call fast fail for safely terminating the process if it's a use mode application, or bug checking the system if it's in kernel mode to bring the system down if it's a hypervisor, all other operating environments as well. We also spent some time improving the entry sources that GS and ASLR use. Both of these mitigations strongly depend on secure and well-generated random numbers for their effectiveness. If we have strong hardware sources available, such as the TPM or RDRAND or other sources, will now take advantage of this. So if you think about how GS cookies are set up in previous versions of the system, essentially every code or every module that was built had a small section of code that was linked into it that would run when the module starts up. And essentially the job of this code was to scrounge up whatever entropy it could get a hold of and use that to build the GS cookie for that module. Now there's some problems with this because that code had to run in a whole bunch of different environments across the system, and so it had couldn't make a lot of assumptions about what APIs are available or the operating environment it's running under. So that made it kind of difficult for it to get good randomization. We alleviated this in Windows 8 by moving this responsibility for initializing the GS cookie to the image loader and user mode, or to the system loader for kernel mode images as well. And that causes these GS cookies to now take advantage of the strong entry sources such as the TPM or RDRAND. We've also hardened the kernel object manager against reference count overflow attacks. So if you had a vulnerability that allowed an object manager to have its reference count simply incremented over and over until it overflows, that'll now result in a bug check. We've also resolved information disclosure for the kernel address space for certain system calls that are not scrubbing the return address register completely. Hand it back over to Matt for an exciting discussion about default settings.
Thanks, Ken. All right, so we've integrated all these great features, but the big question is, what good are they if they aren't enabled, or we can't enable them? So it's important for us to spend a little bit of time talking about the default settings for these mitigations and how not only products that we develop can take advantage of them, but also products that other people develop for Windows can actually take advantage of them too. So the first thing that we wanted to touch on is ARM. And the important thing to keep in mind here with ARM is that we have an opportunity, since we don't have to deal with legacy compatibility issues, to actually be really aggressive in terms of the mitigations that we enable for ARM. And we've tried to take advantage of that to the maximum degree possible. As you can see here, DEP, ASLR, Heap termination, null dereference protection, PXN, all of these things are on ARM, and they can't be disabled. So in particular, if you tried to load a PE image on ARM that didn't opt in to DEP or ASLR, it didn't have those flags set in the PE image, the kernel will actually fail to load the image. So this is something noteworthy, where by virtue of the fact that we're now supporting ARM, we had an opportunity to take advantage of that and be really aggressive in terms of how we turned on mitigations for that platform. In terms of application default settings, a couple of noteworthy things here is that for the new Windows Metro style applications, again, we kind of had an opportunity here where we have a new development platform that applications are being developed against. And because of that, we didn't have necessarily the same type of application compatibility concerns that we have with existing desktop applications. And because of that, we've taken steps to turn on mitigations for all Metro style applications that are developed for Windows 8. So this includes DEP, ASLR, force relocate images, bottom-up, top-down randomization, SEHOP, which we didn't talk about in this talk, but it's been supported since Windows 7 and Windows Vista SP1. In addition, the majority of the inbox applications, these are the applications like Calc and Notepad and other things that are included in Windows 8 by default. In the majority of cases, the mitigations are all turned on there. The one exception is the Force ASLR feature, which is still an opt-in feature. Applications still have to turn this on themselves. And again, that's for performance and compatibility reasons. Internet Explorer 10, when running on Windows 8, takes full advantage of the new mitigation features in Windows 8, as does the new version of Office. But by default, existing applications that run on Windows 8 will still need to explicitly opt in to some of these features. So DEP, ASLR, force relocate, all of these opt-in mitigation features are something that the application still has to explicitly elect to enable. And again, this is to retain application compatibility. In terms of how applications can actually turn these things on, we have a couple of different options. One is we have what's called the mitigation options image file execution option. This is essentially a registry value that you can set for your executable that will turn on these mitigations. This is something that can be used by an application developer themselves or by a system administrator to protect potentially legacy applications that they may not be able to get changes to. We've also added a process creation attribute. So when you're launching a process, you can actually enable these flags for the process that's being created. And we've also added a new API that for certain mitigations can be used, called set process mitigation, that can be used to turn on certain mitigations. And in some cases, there's a new linker flag that you can actually, when you're building your application, set a bit in the image that will turn these on. So I'm not going to go into detail on this table here, other than to note in particular for bottom-up randomization, particularly high entropy bottom-up randomization, we've added a new linker flag called high entropy VA, which is enabled by default, that needs to be set if you want to take advantage of 64-bit high entropy. Okay, so to wrap up, our expectations for exploitation on Windows 8. We believe because of the investments that we've made in Windows 8 and in previous versions of Windows, writing exploits for Windows 8 is going to be very costly. It's something that, in certain cases, we've actually taken steps to mitigate certain vulnerability classes entirely. So if you think back to range checks, and if you think back to the kernel NULL dereference protection, these both turn what were previously elevation of privilege vulnerabilities into things that are now denial of services. And we've also taken steps to make sure that many of the techniques that attackers have relied on in previous versions of Windows are now broken and unreliable. With that said, we expect attackers will shift their focus in a couple of different ways. We think that attackers will continue to target desktop applications that either don't fully enable mitigations or that are running on previous versions of Windows. We expect that trend to continue. We also expect that because of the investments that we've made in hardening ASLR in Windows 8, we expect that attackers are going to increasingly focus on refining techniques for disclosing address-based information. So if you saw Furman's talk, he gave some insight into where researchers might be going there. And we also fully expect that attackers will spend time researching new exploitation techniques. So they'll take stock of the changes that we've made and try to find new ways to develop exploitation techniques in that domain. And with that said, we'll continue to evolve our mitigations. We've already been thinking about things that we'd like to do in the future, and while we're not going to talk about those today, it's something that we'll continue to look at how the attack ecosystem evolves and how we see the field playing out, and we'll continue to evolve our technologies to try to close gaps here. I think one closing point to make is that the investments that we make in mitigation technologies are really geared, as we said, to drive up the cost of developing a reliable exploit. And they're meant to make it such that even if there is a latent vulnerability that's in our software or in software that runs on Windows, even if that's the case, we want to make it as hard as possible for somebody to develop an exploit for it. Hopefully to the degree that it just isn't worth their time to actually even try to write an exploit for it. So the call to action here is, of course, if you want to take advantage of these features, you should probably upgrade to Windows 8 and Internet Explorer 10. From our perspective, 64-bit is certainly best for mitigations, as you saw with the high entropy ASLR. And we also recommend that you enable enhanced protected mode for the desktop version of Internet Explorer 10. If you're a software developer in the audience, we recommend that you build your applications with Visual Studio 2012 if you want to take advantage of some of the same compiler hardening features that were used to build Windows 8. And we also recommend that you enable these opt-in mitigations for your application. It's really important, as we said, such that even if you do have a latent vulnerability in your application, by enabling these mitigations, you're making it that much harder for people to write exploits. And finally, if you're a driver developer, we recommend that you take your existing driver and port it to use non-page pool and X. We have some great guidance on how to do that that's linked here. So I think we're out of time, but if anybody wants to hang around, we can take questions. But yeah, thanks everybody.